Here, at the end of 27 astounding days, there's time for one more moment to define the heart and character of Canadian hockey.
Canadian team went into a hot flare, which seemed to be a little unusual. 1:02 left in the game. Stapleton, he cleared to the open wing to Cornwallier. Cornwallier took a shot, the defenseman fell over. The afternoon, Cornwallier.
The good old hockey game, oh, the good old hockey game is the best game you can name, and the best game you can name is the good old hockey game.
Sports have always been an important part of Canadian culture. Over the course of Canada's history, sport and competition have helped Canadians shape their own unique cultural identity. During the Cold War, sports became an important way for both Eastern and Western nations to display their skill and prowess, as well as their dominance on the international stage. As Gerald Ford once stated, a month before he took the office of U.S. President, a sports triumph can be uplifting to a nation's spirit as well as a battlefield victory. The 1972 Summit Series between the Soviet Union and Team Canada did just that, uplifted Canada's national spirit. But Canadians didn't simply enjoy watching the series like any other hockey game. This showdown had more significance. The historic 1972 Summit Series was not simply a confrontation of two hockey teams. To Canadians, it was a showdown between East and West, capitalism and communism, freedom and oppression. The series was a symbol of victory over the Soviets, and to Canadians and the rest of the world, it symbolizes the ability to triumph over communism. In 1971, Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau met with his Soviet counterpart and organized what would be a friendly 8-game series to be played the following year between Team Canada, made up of famous NHL hockey players, and the Soviet Red Army.
The Summit Series occurred at the height of what is now called the détente era of the Cold War. This simply means that it was a time of less political and military aggression between the Soviets and the West. Détente did not mean that Cold War tensions were not strong. Quite the contrary, the Cold War was still very much alive during this period. In Canada, there had always been a great deal of fear and suspicion regarding the threat of communism, beginning with the conservative newspapers such as the Toronto Telegram. The 1940s was the decade that marked the rise of anti-communist sentiment in Canada. With the end of the Second World War, Canadians had new issues to face, not the least of which was Soviet communism and its influence within Canada. Throughout the next few decades, students in schools practiced emergency drills, procedures to be employed in the case of a Soviet nuclear strike, and characters like Igor Gorenchko brought the fear of the espionage and conspiracy to the forefront of Canadian pop culture.
By 1972, Canadians were more than familiar with the tensions between the Western powers aligned with the United States and the Eastern Soviet superpower, nearly 30 years removed from the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the communist threat. A whole generation of post-war Canadians had now been raised in a bipolar world. They were ready to engage in a competition with their lifelong enemy. They wanted to prove that Canada was a sporting superpower, if not a military giant. During the Cold War, the competition for medals often became a proxy war between East and West, with athletes entering battle to demonstrate national prowess and ideological superiority to audiences at home and abroad. One reporter wrote, "The game in '72 was between two hockey worlds featuring athletes who did not know each other and did not approach the game in remotely the same way or play the same style." As the series progressed, it actually became a confrontation of systems, a confrontation of values. It became a microcosm of the fact that Canada was allied with the West against communism and the East in the Cold War. As the series progressed, the intensity rose.
The Canadians and Russians, young men who didn't know each other, who engaged in a ferocious and highly competitive international contest. Prime Minister Stephen Harper, when reminiscing about watching the series from his Alberta home in 1972, said, "What it came down to was whether the system of a free people was going to triumph over a system of one that had no respect for individuals." I was 13 years old at the time, but I was of the time. For someone who was right at the center, it was an event that reminded Canadians of why we were in the Cold War. It was a pretty important moment in history. As Harper suggested, there was more riding on these hockey games than just a sports victory. The Canadians watched the games not to find out who was better at hockey, but to find out who the victors on the ideological stage. In the eyes of the Canadian public, democracy and freedom were battling against communism and oppression with the most formidable weapons, sticks and pucks. The Summit Series captured the attention of Canadians from coast to coast. Living rooms across the country glowed with the TV footage of the games. In St. John's, Newfoundland, one elementary school had pupils watching the games as part of their lessons. Nurses reported in one hospital that radios were a premium as all most seriously ill turned in. The Canadian team was off to a bad start. Phil Esposito has lost his cool on his teammates and on the Canadian fans in Vancouver's Pacific Coliseum following a bad loss, and it appeared as though the Russian amateurs were to conquer the heroes of the NHL. In the 1970s, the Soviet Union Red Army hockey team was mostly undefeated. They had won multiple Olympic gold medals and thought of themselves as the best of the world, not just the amateur circuit, as the Olympics were still played by amateurs until 1984.
As it began to appear that Team Canada was on its way down in defeat, there was a resurgence of support and pride from the Canadian fans. 3,000 Canadians made the trip to Moscow, and Team Canada received over 10,000 telegraphs from the people at home wishing them good luck. The Canadian hockey team fought their way back to win the series and defeat the Red Army. Excitement among the Canadian public was at an unbelievable high. From St. John's, Newfoundland to Vancouver, Canadians filed out of bars, office buildings, and homes to express their jubilation at the come-from-behind win. An unmatched feeling of hope and triumph was felt by Canadians who felt personally involved in the ideological conflict being played out on the ice. One astonished Canadian, overcome with emotion, remarked to his reporter in a CBC interview following the game, "God is Canadian." Now tell me, Mr. Dion, what was it like to play against some of the best players in the world?
In those days, there was no standing around at the blue line waiting for the puck. You had to make it happen. They were a much younger team than we were, 21 or 22 years old. While our guys were 26 or 27, it was tough.
Mm-hmm. What would you consider to be the most significant thing about playing in the 72 Summit Series?
Sometimes when things happen in life, it takes years to look back and see it properly. And it was the greatest experience. It was more than a game. It was a political issue. It was our system against their system, freedom and communism.
What did it feel like to be a part of the series?
We were in shock when we went to Russia. I often wonder what would have happened if the first games would have been played over there. Watching people in food lines and waiting to see Lenin's tomb, it reached outside of the game. It made us wonder what was going on over here.
Did you feel support by the fans back at home in Canada?
None of us realized the impact the series had on Canadians until we got home. We got a few telegrams, but when we landed, Prime Minister Trudeau and half the country was waiting for us.
The Cold War was a long and grueling ideological struggle between the great powers of the world. Canada, a lesser power in terms of its military, still held an important place on the world stage throughout the Danton era. Closely aligned with the neighboring United States, Canada battled the threat of the Soviet Union in its own way by playing hockey. International sports have always played an important role in major world events. The on-ice battle between the two hockey greats, Canada and the USSR, is a perfect example of the ability of sport to change the face of the world conflicts. The 1972 Summit Series is a significant moment in the Cold War history of Canada because to the Canadian people it represented the ability to defeat communism and overcome oppression.
Pass it out that way. Here's a shot. Henderson made a wild stab towards Bell. Here's another shot. Right by the score. Henderson has scored for Canada. Henderson right in front of the net. And the fans of the team are going wild. Henderson right in front of the goal. 34 seconds left in the game. An absolute bombshell over Paul Henderson after 13.
As everyone is overcome by emotion, there is a realization, forgettable moment.